They laughed at her before she even set her bag down. That was what Maggie Whitmore remembered most about the first moment she arrived at Hawthorne Ranch. Not the heat that pressed against her skin like a flat iron held too close, not the dust that coated her mouth and turned everything the color of old bone. What she remembered was the sound. 6 grown men standing in a loose half circle by the fence post, and every single one of them was laughing. Not the polite kind, not the kind men use when they're pretending to be kind. The open, ugly kind. The kind that comes from somewhere low in a person. One of them, she would later learn his name was Deke, that he'd worked the Hawthorne land for 11 years and considered himself the closest thing to a foreman the ranch had left. Put 2 fingers in his mouth and whistled the way you'd whistle at a livestock auction. The others broke wider. One turned his head and spat into the dirt. Colton Hawthorne stood 10 feet behind them and did not say a word. If you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people who were looking straight at you, if you've ever stood somewhere and understood, in your bones, that every person around you had already decided who you were before you opened your mouth, then you already know exactly what Maggie felt in that moment. You don't need her to explain it. It lives in the body, that feeling. It doesn't leave clean. If you're watching this story and you've ever been that person, the one everyone counted out before you even had a chance to show them, hit that like button right now and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to know how far this story travels. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because what Maggie does next is the kind of thing that will keep you here until the very last word. The wagon that brought her from the Odessa station had taken 4 hours, and the driver, a quiet man named Burl, who smelled like tobacco and axle grease, had barely spoken 10 words the entire trip. She hadn't minded. She'd spent those 4 hours looking at the land. West Texas in late August was not kind to look at. It did not offer itself the way eastern farmland did, with its soft greens and gentle rolls. This land pushed back. It spread flat in every direction and then buckled without warning into dry creek beds and limestone shelves and stretches of caliche, so pale they looked bleached from the inside. The sky above it was enormous in a way that made Maggie feel both very small and, oddly, very clear-headed. Like there was no room out here for pretending. She had not pretended, not once in the weeks since the letter arrived. The letter had come to her mother's house in Haskell County, forwarded twice before it found her, and it was written in the kind of formal lawyer's hand that meant someone had paid for it to look official. Her name appeared 3 times. The terms were laid out without decoration. A rancher in Culberson County required a wife. The arrangement had been made through intermediaries whose names she did not recognize. She would be provided for. The ranch required a capable woman. There was a sum of money mentioned, not enormous, but real, enough to clear her mother's remaining debts and still leave something over. Her cousin Della had read the letter twice over Maggie's shoulder and said, "They want you to go all the way out there and be some stranger's wife? Maggie, that's—" "I know what it is," Maggie had said. "Then why are you even considering it?" Maggie had folded the letter along its original creases and set it on the kitchen table. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she said, "Because nobody here is lining up to offer me anything better." Della hadn't argued, which told Maggie everything she needed to know about what her options were. She was 31 years old. She was, by the measurements the world used for such things, a large woman, broad through the shoulder, heavy through the hip, with hands that had done real work since she was 12 and looked it. She was not what anyone would have called a beauty, by the standard that the magazines and the society women and the men at church socials applied to that word. She had been told this in small ways her entire life, the way you tell a child something is true by never once suggesting it might be otherwise. She had absorbed it the way you absorb rain, not all at once, but steadily, over years, until it was simply part of the weight she carried. What nobody had ever told her, what nobody had ever bothered to notice, was what she could do. She arrived at Hawthorne Ranch on a Wednesday, in a plain brown dress she'd let out at the seams 3 years ago, and never had occasion to replace, with a canvas bag that held 4 changes of clothes, a ledger book she'd kept since she was 19, a bone-handled knife her father had left her, and a dog-eared copy of a range management pamphlet she'd read so many times the spine had given out and she'd tied the pages together with a piece of twine. She had done her reading on the Hawthorne operation before she got on that wagon. She had done a great deal of reading. When the ranch came into view, the main house first, big and sun-bleached and built with the ambition of a different era than the outbuildings, the cattle pens, the water tank sitting lower than it should have been. She felt something move in her chest that wasn't quite dread and wasn't quite excitement. It was more like recognition, like looking at a problem you've seen before in a different form and knowing immediately where it was broken. The ranch was broken. She could see it from a quarter mile out. Then she stepped down from the wagon, and the men laughed, and Colton Hawthorne stood there and let them. I was not what she'd expected. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Some red-faced, blustering old rancher, maybe? The kind you read about in the papers. The kind who wore their land like a badge and talked about it the way some men talked about their own fathers. Instead, Colton Hawthorne was 34, and lean in a way that looked like the land had been pulling at him, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of creek water in autumn, that particular pale gray-green that could look either cold or clear depending on the light. He wasn't ugly. That was almost worse, because the way he stood there, not saying anything, watching his men mock the woman he'd agreed to marry, was an ugliness that didn't show on the surface. It lived somewhere behind his eyes, in the set of his jaw, in the small, careful way he looked at her, measuring, dismissing, moving on, as if she were a piece of equipment someone had shipped to him, and he was already deciding whether to send it back. He stepped forward when the laughter finally died down on its own, not because he'd stopped it, just because it ran out of momentum the way mean things sometimes do, and he extended one hand, businesslike. Margaret Whitmore. Maggie, she said. She didn't reach for his hand right away. She let him wait one beat, two, long enough for it to register. Then she shook it. His grip was firm. She matched it. Something moved across his face. Not quite surprise, more like a recalibration. Burl'll take your bag to the house, he said. We'll get the paperwork squared away before supper. I'd like to see the records first, she said. He blinked. The records. The ranch records. Ledgers. Breeding logs. Water tallies. Cattle census. Whatever you've got. Behind him, she heard one of the hands, Deke, she would learn, let out a short sound that was almost a laugh again, pressed down into something quieter. She didn't look at him. Colton looked at her for a long moment. The muscles in his jaw moved. Then he said, "You just got off a wagon." "I know when I got off the wagon," she said. "I'd still like to see the records." Whatever he was expecting from the woman his rivals had arranged for him to marry, and she had no illusions about what this arrangement was. She'd understood it from the first line of that letter. It was not this. She could see him reorganizing something behind his eyes, not sure yet what category to put her in. "After supper," he said finally. She nodded. She'd take that. The house was large and badly kept in the way that happened when a place had been built for a woman and then gone 20 years without one. Not dirty, exactly. Someone had been maintaining the bare minimum, but hollow. The rugs were faded past any pattern. The kitchen had the particular smell of meals made out of obligation rather than care. There were hooks on the wall by the back door with nothing hanging on them that looked like they'd been waiting a long time. Maggie unpacked her bag into the room they'd given her. A room separated from the master bedroom by a wall and a locked connecting door, a detail she noticed without comment. And she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the ceiling and let herself feel for exactly 5 minutes everything she was not going to allow herself to feel in front of anyone else in this house. She was a long way from anyone who knew her. She was in a house full of people who had already decided she was a joke. She was married, in all but the final paperwork, to a man who had looked at her the way you look at a wrong order that's arrived from the kitchen and there's nothing to do but eat it. 5 minutes. Then she stood up, washed her face in the basin, dried it, went downstairs, and asked the woman who had been managing the kitchen, a hired woman named Clara, who looked at Maggie with the particular wariness of someone waiting to see which way the wind was going to blow, where Colton kept his ranch records. Clara pointed at a room off the main hall. A study. Door half open. Maggie went in without knocking. The records were in worse shape than she'd feared and better shape than they had any right to be, given everything. Someone, at some point, had been meticulous. The older ledgers, the ones from the father's era, were neat, precise, cross-referenced in a system that made immediate sense once you understood the notation. She could see the mind behind them, careful and practical and deeply knowledgeable. Then there was a gap. An 18-month period where the entries became sparse, then erratic, then nearly absent. The father had died. Colton had taken over. And after that, Colton's hand was identifiable immediately, the script angular and slightly impatient. The records resumed, but they were incomplete. Dates missing, numbers rounded where they shouldn't be, breeding decisions logged without any apparent rationale, water usage tracked inconsistently. She was still reading when Colton appeared in the doorway. "Supper's been ready for 20 minutes, he said. "I know," she said. She didn't look up. She had the breeding log open across her knees and the water ledger open on the desk, and she was looking at both of them at once, seeing a thing she hadn't expected to see so quickly, a pattern that ran underneath the surface numbers like a crack in a foundation wall. Who made the decision to switch the South Herd's grazing rotation in '89? Silence from the doorway. She looked up. Colton was staring at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, something between irritation and a more reluctant, complicated thing. "My father did," he said after a moment, "before he got sick. And you continued it after. It's how it's always been done. It's why your South pasture looks the way it does," she said. "It's been stripped past recovery on the eastern half. The cattle are eating themselves into a corner and the grass can't come back fast enough. You've got maybe 2 seasons before that section's dead ground." I was very still in the doorway. "I'd also like to talk about the Hereford to Longhorn ratio," she said. "Your father was building towards something with that breeding program, but whoever continued it after him—" She stopped, chose her words. "The choices in the last 4 years don't match the goal." Colton walked into the room. He didn't sit. He stood on the other side of the desk and looked at the open ledgers, and then he looked at her, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that wagon, she saw something in his face that wasn't calculation or dismissal or performed indifference. It was something closer to alarm. "You read breeding records," he said. "I grew up on a working farm," she said. "Small operation, but my father kept good books, and he taught me to read them. I've been studying range management for 3 years." She set the breeding log down. "Mr. Hawthorne, I'm not going to pretend I know this specific land yet. I don't. But I can see what these numbers are telling me, and what they're telling me is that this ranch has been running on old decisions made for different conditions. Some of those decisions need to change." He pulled a chair from the corner of the room and sat down in it heavily, and for a moment he looked less like the arrogant heir to a cattle empire, and more like a tired man who had been alone with a problem he couldn't solve for a very long time. "My father built something real out here," he said. It came out quieter than she expected. "I know," she said. "I can see it in the early ledgers. He was good." Something in his face shifted at that, just slightly. "Supper's going to be cold," he said. "I don't mind cold supper," she said. He looked at the ledgers. Then he looked at her. Then he said, with a reluctance she could almost feel, "What else did you find?" They ate cold supper at opposite ends of a table built for 8, and they talked. Not warmly, not easily, but with the specific tension of 2 people who were circling around a problem that was bigger than either of them, and both knew it. Colton pushed back on 3 of the things she said. She pushed back on 2 of his corrections. He was wrong about the water table data, and she told him so and cited the page number. He went and got the ledger and looked at the page number and came back to the table and didn't apologize, but he didn't argue further either. It was not a comfortable meal. It was not anywhere close to easy. But it was real in a way that the silence would not have been, and Maggie held on to that. She was washing her own plate in the kitchen. Clara had gone home at dark, one of the small economies of a ranch spending more than it was making, when she heard boots on the back steps, and then Deke's voice, low and meant to carry just enough, saying to someone outside, "Give her 2 weeks before she turns around and heads back home. Girl like that can't handle this country." Maggie set the plate down on the drying board. She went to the back door and opened it. Deke was on the steps with 2 other hands, all 3 of them with their hats pushed back on their heads, in the way of men who thought they were alone. All 3 of them looked at her. "2 weeks is a generous estimate," Maggie said. Her voice was level. She wasn't angry, or rather, she was, but anger was a fire you kept banked until you needed it for something useful. "I'll make you a different one. You've got about 6 weeks of normal range capacity left in the south pasture before the next rotation has to happen, or you lose the growth cycle permanently. I'd focus on that." Deke looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked back at the other men. Then he spit off the side of the steps. Maggie went back inside and finished washing the dishes. Through the kitchen window, she could see the big open darkness of the Texas night spreading in every direction, enormous and indifferent and completely unconcerned with what anyone out here wanted or needed. The land didn't care about her. It didn't care about Colton Hawthorne or his father's legacy or the men who'd laughed at her by the fence post. That was the thing about land. It just kept going. It kept doing what it did. The only question was whether you were paying close enough attention to understand what it was telling you. Maggie dried her hands on the rough kitchen towel and looked out at the dark and thought, I see you. She thought, I'm paying attention. She thought, give me time. She picked up the water ledger she'd brought in from the study and carried it upstairs, and she read it by lamplight until her eyes gave out, cross-referencing the numbers against the rainfall records, finding the shape of the problem underneath the surface of the data. Not like a woman who had come to this place because nobody had offered her anything better, but like someone who had been waiting her whole life for a problem exactly this size. She fell asleep with the ledger open across her chest and the lamp still burning. In the morning, there was work to do. The water ledger was still on her chest when she woke. The lamp burned down to a thin blue thread of smoke, and the first sound she heard was boots on the hardwood floor below her. Colton, up before dawn the way men who'd grown up on working ranches always were, moving through the house with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd done the same route so many times his body didn't need his mind for it anymore. Maggie lay still for a moment and listened to the ranch come awake around her. The cattle in the far pen, the particular low complaint of animals that knew the routine. A door somewhere, the wind off the flat country finding every gap in the old house's framing. The creak of the pump handle outside, once, twice. She got up, washed her face, dressed, and went downstairs with the ledger under her arm. Colton was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a map spread open in front of him, the kind of hand-drawn ranch map that got updated every few years and then ignored until something went wrong. He looked up when she came in. He looked at the ledger under her arm. He looked at her face, which she kept neutral with the practice of someone who'd been keeping her face neutral in front of people who were watching for weakness since she was about 12 years old. There's coffee, he said. She poured a cup and sat down across from him, not at the far end of the table the way they'd been the night before, but closer. Close enough to see the map properly. She set the ledger on the table between them and opened it to the page she'd marked with a strip of torn paper. The water system, she said. Walk me through what your father built and what's been added since. He looked at her for a moment. Something in him was still deciding something. She could feel it, the way you feel a door that's neither fully open nor fully closed. Then he pulled the map toward them both and started talking. This was how the first real conversation happened. Not over supper with its formal distance, not in the charged air of the study where she'd been reading his father's records without invitation, but here, in the early morning with bad coffee going cold between them and a map that had coffee rings on it already from previous mornings. He talked about the water system, 2 wells, a series of surface tanks the old man had dug in the 1870s, a pipeline that ran from the northern tank to the main cattle operation that had been repaired so many times. Different sections of it were made of 3 different materials. He talked about it the way men talked about infrastructure they'd inherited and never fully understood, with a mix of pride in what it represented and a vague unease about what they didn't know. Maggie listened. She asked questions, not the kind of questions designed to expose what he didn't know, but the kind that came from genuine need for information, specific and technical, and requiring specific technical answers. What was the yield on the north well in a dry month? What was the capacity of the largest surface tank? Where did the pipeline lose pressure? He answered all of them. Some of the answers were exact. Some were approximate. A few he said he'd have to look up, and she noticed that he said it without the defensiveness she'd expected, which told her something she filed away. By the time Clara arrived to start breakfast, they had been talking for 2 hours, and the map had her notes in the margins in pencil, and he hadn't told her to stop writing on it. She spent the first week learning the land. Not the way someone learns a place by walking through it pleasantly. She walked through it the way a doctor walks through a hospital, looking at everything with the specific attention of someone trying to understand what was wrong. She got up before the hands and was out before most of them had their boots on, moving through the pastures with a notebook and the hand-drawn maps she'd copied from the originals, making her own marks, her own measurements where she could, her own observations. The south pasture was worse than the ledger had suggested. Standing in the middle of it on the third morning, she could see the pattern clearly. The overgrazing moved in concentric rings out from the water point, exactly as you'd expect when cattle were left on the same ground too long without rotation. The grass closest to the tank was gone past stubble. 20 yards out, it was thin and stressed. 40 yards out, it began to look something close to normal. But even there, she could see the soil compaction from years of the same hooves on the same paths. She crouched and picked up a handful of the dry earth near the water tank and let it fall through her fingers. It was pale and fine, and it fell like sand, nothing holding it together. Good topsoil had a different weight to it, a different texture. It clumped slightly. It had life in it. This didn't. You planning to eat it or just study it? She stood and turned. Deke was 10 yards behind her on his horse, looking down at her with the specific expression of a man who found her presence on the land he considered his territory personally offensive. I was a capable-looking man, lean and weathered in the way of someone who'd spent 20 years outside, and he wore his contempt without any particular effort to conceal it. Both pastures on the south rotation need to rest for at least 60 days, she said. Longer if we can manage it. The soil around this water point needs to be fenced off. Cattle access cut back to twice a day. Controlled. Deke looked at her the way you look at someone who has just said something in a language you don't speak. That's not how this operation runs. I know how this operation runs, she said. That's the problem. She walked back toward the main house, and she felt his eyes on her back the whole way, and she didn't hurry. The breeding records took her 4 days to fully reconstruct. She spread the ledgers across the study floor. Colton had stopped coming into the study during the hours she was working in it, some negotiated boundary that neither of them had stated explicitly, and she built a timeline on a sheet of paper, tracking every breeding decision across 10 years, marking which decisions had followed a coherent plan and which had been made without apparent reference to anything that came before. The picture that emerged was painful. Colton's father had been building toward something specific, a Hereford cross program that would have produced cattle suited to this particular land, more heat-tolerant than the purebreds, more marketable than the longhorns that had made the original reputation of the ranch. He'd been 3 or 4 breeding cycles away from seeing real results when he died. Then the decisions stopped making sense. Not because they were obviously wrong, they were the kind of decisions that looked reasonable in isolation, but because they didn't build on each other. They were reactive, responding to market prices at the time of each decision, chasing what was selling, rather than holding the line toward the goal the old man had been working toward. She was still sitting on the floor with the papers around her when Colton appeared in the doorway. It was past 9 at night. "Clara said you didn't come in for supper," he said. "I ate something earlier." She hadn't, quite, but she'd had coffee and she'd been too deep in the numbers to notice the difference until now, when her stomach said something sharp. He looked at the papers on the floor. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "That's my father's handwriting." "Yes." He came into the room and sat down on the floor, not at the desk, on the floor, which surprised her. And he looked at the timeline she'd drawn and the breeding records spread around her in the rough chronological order she'd arranged them. "He used to work in here every night," Colton said. It came out like something he hadn't meant to say. "I'd fall asleep hearing him in this room, the scratch of the pen." Maggie didn't say anything. There were moments when saying nothing was the only thing that didn't ruin what was happening. "What did you find?" he said, after a while. She told him. She laid it out as plainly as she could. What his father had been building, where the plan had been, what had happened to it in the years since, and what it would take to get back on a coherent course. She was careful about it. She didn't say the words that were true, but would not help anything, the words that would have sounded like blame. She talked about the plan, about the cattle, about the land. He listened without interrupting, which she was learning was one of the things he did that she hadn't expected from him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long to get back to where he was heading?" 3 breeding cycles minimum, she said. 4 if we're being realistic. Maybe 5 if the market moves against us. He made a sound that was not quite a sigh. 5 years. His records suggest he'd been at it for 7 already, she said. He was close. Something moved across Colton's face at that. Not grief exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that had grief somewhere in its history. He looked at the papers on the floor, and she could see him doing the calculation that men who'd inherited things always eventually had to do. The calculation between what they'd been given and what they'd done with it. "What do you need?" he said. She looked at him carefully. "What do you mean?" "To run the breeding program the way it should be run. What do you need?" It was the first time he'd said anything that sounded like an actual question rather than a management of her presence. The first time he'd asked for something real. "Access to the records without having to explain myself every time I go into this room," she said. "Authority to make recommendations directly to the hands without going through you for every small thing. And I need to talk to whoever you buy your cattle from, because the last two purchases were the wrong animals for what you're trying to build." He was quiet. "That's going to be a problem with Dake," he said. "I know," she said. "Deke is a problem I'll handle." He looked at her. The lamp was low, and the light made his face harder to read than it usually was. "He's been on this ranch since before my father died," he said. "He knows this land better than anyone." "He knows this land the way it was 10 years ago," Maggie said. "That's not the same thing as knowing what it needs now." She paused. "I'm not asking you to fire him. I'm asking you to let me do my work." Another silence, longer this time. Outside, the wind had come up the way it did out here in the late evening, finding the spaces in the old house. "All right," Colton said. He said it slowly, like a man putting weight on ice he wasn't fully sure about. "All right." He stood up and left the room, and Maggie sat alone on the study floor with the papers and the low lamp, and let herself feel, for a moment, the particular satisfaction of a door that had been closed beginning, just barely, to open. The first real fight happened on a Tuesday, 11 days after she'd arrived. She had spoken to the hands at the morning gathering, Colton's standing arrangement, every morning at sunrise, ranch work assignments doled out. And she had redirected 2 of the assigned tasks, pulled 2 men off fence repair on the east section to begin the fencing work around the south water point that she needed done, and reassigned the afternoon grazing shift to move the south herd to the far west pasture and hold them there. Deke countermanded both assignments within an hour. She found out from one of the younger hands, a boy named Toby, 17 years old, who had the manner of someone who'd learned early that the safest place to be was invisible, who came to find her in the study and stood in the doorway turning his hat in his hands, and said, looking at a point about a foot to the left of her face, "Ma'am, Deke said the south herd's staying put, and the fencing crew's going back to the east section." Maggie set down her pen. "Where's Deke right now?" she said. North Pen, I think." Checking the... She was already moving. She found him at the North Pen, exactly where Toby said, talking to 2 of the older hands with the easy authority of a man who considered the land under his feet to belong to him in every way that mattered. He saw her coming, and he straightened slightly. Not out of respect, but the way an animal straightens when it sees something approaching it isn't sure about yet. "You countermanded my work assignments," she said. She didn't slow down. She stopped close enough that he had to look at her directly, which she could see he didn't like. "I reorganized the work to match what the ranch actually needs," he said. "The east fence has been down 3 weeks. That herd doesn't move." "The east fence can wait another 3 days," she said. "The south pasture cannot. You know how that land looks right now, Deke. You've worked it for 11 years. Don't tell me you haven't noticed." Something flickered in his face. He had noticed. She could see that he had noticed and had filed it somewhere under things he wasn't ready to think about yet. "The way a ranch gets worked isn't decided by..." He stopped. Chose, visibly, a different word than the one he'd been going to use. "By someone who's been here less than 2 weeks. It is when Mr. Hawthorne has said it is," she said. "Mr. Hawthorne hasn't said a thing to me." "Then let's go ask him." That was the part Deke hadn't expected. She could see it in the small pause, the recalculation. Men who relied on hierarchy to enforce their position were always surprised when someone called the question directly. He'd expected her to back down, or to go complain to Colton privately, or to absorb the challenge the way he'd seen women absorb challenges, quietly, internally, with that specific silence that was not acceptance but looked like it from the outside. She walked toward the main house without waiting to see whether he followed. He followed. She heard his boots on the ground behind her. Colton was in the barn. She found him there with a hand on the side of a horse that had been favoring one leg since she'd arrived, working at something near the hoof, with the focused attention of a man who was better with animals than with most of the human problems in his life. He looked up when she came in, then passed her at Deke. There's a disagreement about the work assignments, Maggie said. She kept her voice level. Deke reversed 2 of my redirections this morning. I need to know who has authority here so the hands know who to listen to. Colton straightened slowly. He looked at Deke, then at her, and she could see him reading the room with the speed of someone who'd grown up in this particular dynamic. The ranch boss caught between the established order and a change the established order didn't want. What'd you change? He said to her. She told him. 2 minutes, precise. The why and the what. Colton looked at Deke. Let the south pasture go, he said. Do the fencing she want. Deke's jaw set. Colton. Deke. 1 word. But something in it landed differently than she'd expected. Not hard, not commanding, just final. The kind of final that came from a long history between 2 people and the acknowledgement of where that history had now arrived. Deke looked at her. She didn't do anything with her face. She just looked back. He turned and walked out of the barn. Colton went back to the horse's hoof. After a moment he said, without looking up, He won't make it easy. I know, she said. He was my father's man before he was mine. I understand that, she said. I'm not trying to undo 11 years. I'm trying to fix the south pasture. A pause. The horse shifted its weight. Colton worked at something with a pick, and the horse settled again. He's not wrong that the east fence needs doing, Colton said. I know he's not, she said. I'll have it done by end of week, but the south water point gets fenced first. Another pause. All right, he said. She went back to the house. Behind her she heard him, very quietly, say something to the horse. She didn't catch the words. She wasn't meant to. 3 weeks in, the drought that had been threatening from the southwest arrived in earnest. It didn't come dramatically. West Texas drought never did, not the real kind. It came as a continuation, an extension, a deepening of what had already been. The sky stayed high and pale, and the heat sat on the land like something physical, and the surface tanks dropped and kept dropping, and the grass that had already been stressed bent further and didn't spring back. Maggie had been watching the weather patterns in the records, and the drought didn't surprise her. What surprised her was the speed. The northern tank dropped 8 inches in 10 days. The pipeline pressure fell, which meant the leak she'd identified in the main line. A slow seep she'd marked on her copy of the ranch map and flagged to Colton in her 3rd day there was now costing them water they couldn't afford to lose. She went to Colton on a Thursday morning with her notebook and her maps and the rainfall records from the past 7 years, and she laid out what she was seeing. He listened. His face was the face of a man who already knew it was bad and was bracing to find out how bad. The south herd needs to move now, she said. Not next week, this week. They need to go to the northwest section near the secondary well. The northwest section isn't ideal, but it's got grass and it's got water access that doesn't depend on the main tank. The northwest section is rough country, he said. Moving a herd that size through there. I know it's rough, she said. It's less rough than losing the herd to a water shortage. He looked at the rainfall records. He looked at the tank measurements she'd been taking every 3 days since she arrived. She'd started taking them on her own initiative, not asked, just doing it, and he'd noticed and hadn't said anything, which she'd understood as a kind of permission. How long before the main tank is critical, he said. At current rate, with the leak? 6 weeks. Maybe less if the heat holds. He was quiet. I can fix the pipeline leak, she said. I found it. I need 2 men for a day and a half and the right materials. Colton, she stopped. It was the first time she'd used his given name without the Mr. in front of it, and she hadn't planned it. It had just come out. She saw him register it, but he didn't react to it. This is manageable. But we have to move now. If we wait for the situation to be obviously critical, it'll already be too late. He looked at her for a long moment. There was something happening behind his eyes that she couldn't entirely read. The usual calculation, but with something else in it now, something that had been building in the 3 weeks since she'd arrived and sat on the study floor with his father's papers and asked him what he needed. How long to move the south herd, he said. 2 days? 3 at most. Who do you want on it? Not whether she should do it. Who she wanted on it. She told him. She named 4 men, including Toby, which she could see him note with something between surprise and acceptance. She did not name Deke. She named a man named Russ instead, older than Deke, quieter, one of the ones who hadn't laughed on the day she arrived. Russ had been watching her for 3 weeks with a careful attention she'd begun to think of as the beginning of something. Colton told the hands that afternoon. Deke didn't say anything in front of Colton. He waited until the gathering broke up, and then he fell in beside her as she was walking back toward the house, and he said quietly, meant only for her, "You're going to run this ranch into the ground faster than it was going on its own." Maggie stopped walking. She turned and looked at him, and she held the look for 3 full seconds, which is longer than most people realize. And then she said, "The northwest section's got water and grass, and the south herd's going to have a better fall because of it. If I'm wrong, you can say so in November." She turned and kept walking. She heard him make a sound behind her. Not a laugh this time, something flatter, something that was trying to decide between contempt and something else. The pipeline repair took a day and a half, exactly as she'd said. She was on her knees in the dirt for most of it, not overseen from a distance, but actually there, because the repair required knowing exactly where the failure point was, and she was the one who'd found it, and she trusted herself to identify it on the ground more than she trusted the description she could give someone else. Russ worked beside her without comment, handing her things when she needed them, holding the section of pipe steady while she fitted the coupling. Toby was there too, and she showed him what to look for. The discoloration in the soil, the specific sound of water under pressure finding a gap, because he was going to be on this land for years, and he might as well start understanding it. By the end of the second day, the line was holding. She tested it herself, walking the run from the main tank to the cattle operation, listening, watching the ground for the dark, wet patches that had given away the leak. Nothing. The pressure at the far end of the line came up by the next morning. Colton came and found her when she was washing her hands at the pump. He'd seen the pressure reading. "It's holding," he said. "It'll hold," she said. "I'd check it again in 2 weeks. The fitting's sound, but the surrounding soil's been waterlogged. Might shift." He nodded. He stood there for a moment in the late afternoon, the light going long and low the way it did out here, and he looked at the repaired section of pipe, and then at her, and he said, "Where did you learn to do that?" "My father," she said, "and a lot of reading." He looked like he was going to say something and then didn't. She finished drying her hands and started to move past him, and he said, "Maggie." She stopped. "Thank you," he said. Just that. Simple. Without the reluctance she'd come to expect from him. She looked at him. He looked uncomfortable with his own sincerity, which she thought was probably the most honest she'd seen him be. "You're welcome," she said, and kept walking. What? The herd move took 2.5 days and was not without its disasters. Toby got thrown on the second morning. Not badly. He wasn't hurt, but it shook him, and he was useless for an hour after, sitting on a rock with his hat in his hands, and his face doing the complicated work of a 17-year-old who didn't want anyone to see that he was rattled. Maggie came and sat beside him on the rock, not saying anything for a while, and then she said, "I've been thrown 3 times. Worst one was off a mule my father kept that had no business being kept. You get back up because you've got cattle that don't care whether you're embarrassed." Toby looked at her from under his hair. "Did it hurt?" "Hurt? Like the ground was personal about it," she said. "You ready?" He put his hat back on. "Yes, ma'am." They got the herd to the northwest section in the late afternoon of the third day, and the cattle found the water and the grass with the incurious efficiency of animals doing what their bodies required, and Maggie stood on a rise and watched and let herself feel, for a moment, the specific satisfaction of a thing that had needed to be done getting done. Russ came and stood near her. He was a man of few words, but he'd been working beside her for 3 days now, and she'd begun to understand the particular economy of him, the way he communicated in the spaces between words. "South pasture'll come back if we leave it alone," he said. Not a question. "If we give it the time," she said. "Deke's been running cattle on it continuous for 4 years," Russ said. He said it flat, without inflection. "I know," she said. "He was doing what the old man always did. Didn't know it needed changing." She looked at him. Russ was looking out at the cattle. His face said nothing. But the words said something, and she understood them. "Nobody's blaming him for what he didn't know," she said. Russ nodded once, slowly. Then he went to check on Toby. The breeding proposal came on a Thursday evening, 5 weeks after Maggie arrived, and it was the thing that nearly broke everything they'd been quietly building. She'd been working on it for 2 weeks, careful, thorough, cross-referenced against the old records, and 3 separate range management publications she'd sent away for and received in a packet from the Odessa post office. She brought it to Colton in the study after supper, 10 pages of her neat handwriting organized into sections, with notes in the margins and a projected timeline, and at the end, a dollar figure. He read it. All of it, which she hadn't been certain he would. He read it the way he'd read the other things she'd brought him, carefully, with a specific attention that she'd come to understand was genuine. Whatever else about him was complicated. When he looked up, his face had the expression of a man who'd just been handed a bill he couldn't pay. "This is Maggie, this number." "I know," she said. "Where do you think this money comes from?" "I know where it comes from," she said. "I've seen the accounts." "Then you know we don't have it." "We don't have all of it," she said. "We have roughly a third. I've broken the plan into phases. The first phase, the most critical decisions, costs about 40% of the total. If the first phase works the way I believe it will, the sale prices in the next 2 years offset the second phase cost." He looked at the dollar figure again. She could see him doing the math she'd already done a dozen times, looking for a different answer. "And if it doesn't work," he said, "then we've spent money on better cattle, and that's not the end of the world," she said. "Colton, this plan your father was building toward. The cattle at the end of it are worth twice what you're selling now, possibly more. The breeding decisions in the last 4 years cost you that margin because they were chasing the short market. I understand why. But every year you continue chasing the short market is a year further from what your father was building." He set the pages down on the desk. He looked at his hands for a moment, which was a thing she'd noticed he did when he was working through something he wasn't ready to say yet. "There are ranchers in this county," he said slowly, "who would pay a great deal to see this operation fail." "I know," she said. She'd gathered that from the ledgers, from the legal notices she'd found tucked into the back of an accounts folder, from the specific way Colton went quiet when certain names came up in conversation. "If we spend this and it doesn't turn," he said, "those men are going to be circling." "Then it had better turn," she said. He looked at her. His face was doing the thing it did sometimes, the thing she'd started to recognize as him arriving at the edge of something and not yet being sure whether to step off it. "You're that certain?" he said. "I'm certain about the breeding decisions," she said. "I'm certain about the range management. I'm not certain about the weather or the market, and I can't promise you either of those. But the plan is sound, Colton. Your father built a sound foundation, and he was 3 cycles from seeing it pay. I'm asking you to finish what he started." The lamp between them was the only light in the room. Outside, the night wind moved across the flat country with its particular indifference, and somewhere in the dark a coyote said something to the sky that went unanswered. Colton picked up the pages again. He looked at the timeline. He looked at the first phase cost, and then at the projected return, and then at the timeline again. "I need 3 days," he said. "Take them," she said. She gathered her notes and left him in the study, and she climbed the stairs and did not let herself think too hard about what it would mean if he said no, because that was a direction that didn't help anything, and the only direction that mattered was the one you were moving in. 3 days later, Colton came to find her at the South Water Point where she was checking the new fencing with Toby, and he said, in the flat, deliberate way of a man who had made a decision and was committed to it, "Write out what you need for the first phase. I'll make the arrangements." Toby looked at her face and looked away again quickly, with the instinct of a young person who understands that some moments belong to other people. Maggie wrote down what she needed and handed the list to Colton, and he folded it and put it in his shirt pocket, and that was that. Not a celebration, not a handshake, not any of the forms that might have made it feel more significant from the outside. Just a man putting a piece of paper in his pocket and walking back across the dry ground toward the main house, and a woman watching him go with the specific knowledge that they had just made a bet with everything the Hawthorne name still had left, and that she had better be right. The south pasture grass was already, if you looked very close, beginning to come back in the thin, early way that things come back after they've been given room. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she went to see about the cattle. The first cattle Maggie ordered arrived on a Tuesday in late October, 6 weeks after Colton put her list in his shirt pocket and made the arrangements. There were 14 of them, 9 cows and 5 bulls, a specific Hereford cross she'd identified through correspondence with a breeder in central Texas, whose bloodline records she'd studied the way other women studied recipes. They came off the transport looking road-worn and irritable, and two of the hands who'd been assigned to receive them stood at the fence looking at the animals with the particular skepticism of men who believed that what they already knew was all there was to know. One of them said, loud enough to carry, "Don't look like much." Russ, who was standing beside Maggie, said nothing. Maggie said nothing either. She was looking at the cattle with the focused attention she'd been building toward for 3 months, checking against what she'd read and what she'd been told by the breeder and what her own eyes were now telling her, and what they were telling her was that the animals were tired and underselling themselves the way living things sometimes did when they'd been moved too fast and too far. But underneath that, they were solid. The bone structure was right. The breadth through the chest was right. A bull near the back of the group had the specific carriage of an animal that knew its own quality. "They'll do," she said, to no one in particular. She went into the pen to look more closely and didn't think twice about it, and she heard the two skeptical hands go quiet with the silence of people who had expected her to stand at the fence. The drought that had arrived in late summer did not leave. It deepened instead, the way West Texas drought sometimes did. Not in dramatic visible stages, but in the incremental arithmetic of deficit, each week a little more taken out than was put back. The land's account drawing down toward something that didn't have a good name. By November, the main tank was holding, thanks to the pipeline repair, but 3 of the surface tanks in the southern sections had dropped below useful levels. The river that fed the westernmost property line had narrowed to a thread. Maggie tracked it all in a notebook she now kept specifically for water data, daily measurements, daily calculations, the slow, patient work of understanding a system under stress, so you could see the critical moment coming before it arrived. She was on her 3rd notebook by December. Colton had started reading them. She'd found the first one moved from where she'd left it, set back in a slightly different position, and she hadn't said anything about it, and neither had he. But after that, she started leaving them in the study in the evenings rather than carrying them upstairs. The neighboring ranches were struggling visibly now. The Alderton place to the east had already moved 2 herds to leased land in the north. Expensive, a stopgap, the kind of decision that bought time but ate margin. The Hardcastle operation on the west had begun selling off cattle ahead of the market, and the word coming back through the stock agents was that the price they were getting was bad and getting worse, because everyone knew why you were selling if you were selling in winter into a drought year. Maggie thought about the Hardcastle cattle, what kind they were, what prices they were accepting, more than she let on. She brought it up to Colton on a cold night in early December, the kind of cold that was specific to this country. Not the wet cold of the east, but a dry, deep cold that got into the buildings and didn't leave. "Hardcastle's selling longhorn crosses," she said. 300 head at least, according to what I've heard. Colton looked up from the accounts he'd been working on. "I know. The price he's getting is bad." "Very bad," Colton agreed. "If he sells at that price, it sets the regional reference low for the next season," she said. "Every buyer in the county uses what Hardcastle gets as a baseline." Colton sat back in his chair. He looked at the fire, which had burned down to something small and steady that neither of them had gotten up to tend. "There's nothing to do about Hardcastle's price." "No," she said. "But there's something to do about ours." She set her notebook on the table between them. "The first phase cattle are going to take 2 seasons to show their quality in market animals. We knew that. But if we can hold our current herd through the drought without distress selling, we come into next year's market from a different position than everyone else in this county. Holding the herd through this drought costs money. I know what it costs," she said. "I've run the numbers 6 times. I want to show you something." She opened the notebook to the page she'd marked and turned it to face him. "If we move the main herd now, not sell, move, rotate through the northwest section and the secondary pastures on a compressed schedule, we reduce feed supplement costs by about 30%. The northwest section has more remaining grass than I thought. The cattle we moved in October have been grazing it efficiently because of the lower stock density." He looked at the numbers. She watched him read them the way he'd been reading her notebooks, with the attention of someone who'd started to trust the source even when the numbers told him things he didn't want to hear. "And if the northwest section grass gives out," he said. "Then we reassess," she said. "But Colton, it won't. I've been measuring the growth rate in the northwest section for 2 months and the consumption rate for the herd we've got there now. The math holds." She paused. "I know it looks like a lot of confidence." "It does," he said, but he said it without the edge it would have had 3 months ago. The alternative is doing what everyone else is doing, she said. And you can see what that's getting them. He was quiet for a while. The fire made a small settling sound. When would you move them? He said. End of the week, she said, before the cold gets worse. He nodded once, the way he'd gotten into the habit of nodding when he'd made up his mind and didn't feel the need to put words around it. Deke had been quiet since the confrontation in the barn. Not cooperative, quiet. There was a difference, and Maggie understood it. He came to the morning gatherings and took his assignments and did his work, and did not argue with her directly, but she could feel the opposition in the negative space of it, in the way certain conversations stopped when she walked into them, in the way some of the older hands watched her with the particular wariness of people who were waiting to see which way something was going to fall. She was not naive about what Deke was doing. She'd grown up around men like him, careful, territorial, committed to a version of things they'd been building for years and not ready to let go of. She didn't think he was a bad man. She thought he was a man who'd organized his entire sense of himself around this ranch and the way it worked, and she was asking him to rearrange something he'd believed was permanent. What she hadn't anticipated was where it would break. The break came on a Wednesday in mid-December, 2 weeks into the Northwest herd rotation, when she came into the barn at midday to check on one of the new Hereford bulls that had been off his feed since the cold came in, and she found Deke there with two of the older hands, and she heard, before they knew she was there, what was being said. Woman doesn't know what a hard winter does to this land. Come spring, when those fancy cattle start dropping, she'll have some explaining to do. Colton's not going to listen to reason. Colton's not thinking straight. She's got him. She came around the corner of the stall, and all three of them went quiet with the abrupt silence of people caught, and she stood there and looked at them, and she felt something move through her that wasn't anger. She'd been past anger with Deke for a while now, but something colder and more purposeful. I need to check the bull, she said. You can finish this conversation somewhere else. Deke looked at her. In his face was the full accumulation of 4 months of not saying what he thought, and she could see it sitting there under the surface, looking for a way out. He's fine, Deke said. Checked him this morning. I'll check him myself, she said. Mrs. Hawthorne. He said the name the way you'd put a tool down that didn't belong to you. This ranch has run through hard winters before. What you're doing with the herd rotation, with these new animals, this is not how this land gets worked. The south pasture is resting, she said. The northwest section is holding. The pipeline has been holding for 4 months. The new cattle are sound. She kept her voice even because if she let it go anywhere else, this conversation was going to become something nobody could walk back from. What specifically is your objection? He stared at her. She could see him sorting through the real objections, the ones that were about the cattle and the land, from the one underneath all of them, which was that he believed a woman who'd arrived on a wagon 8 weeks after he'd already worked this ground for over a decade should not be standing in this barn telling him what was what. You're risking the herd, he said, on ideas from books. The pipeline fix wasn't from a book, she said. The south pasture rotation wasn't from a book. Those came from looking at what this specific land was doing and deciding what it needed. She looked at him steadily. Deke, I know what you think of me. I've known since the day I got here. But the ranch is still standing, and the cattle are in better position than they were in August. And if you have a specific objection to what I'm doing, I would genuinely like to hear it. Not here. She glanced at the two hands, who were very intently studying their boots. Come to the study tonight. Bring whatever you want to bring. Show me where I'm wrong. Deke looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked past her and out of the barn, and the two hands went with him, and Maggie stood in the cold barn with the Hereford bull, who was in fact fine, and she put one hand on the animal's neck and just breathed for a moment. Deke did not come to the study that night. The wildfire started in the Alderton pasture on a Saturday in late January. Nobody knew at first exactly how. A fence line, probably, a wire and a dry post, and something that caught in the wind. The wind was the problem, the same high, flat wind that scoured the landscape clean and had no patience for things in its way. By the time anyone saw the smoke, it was already a problem, and by the time the problem was understood, it was already worse. Maggie was doing her morning water measurements at the north well when she smelled it. Smoke in this country in winter had a specific quality. It wasn't the pleasant smell of a house fire or a cook fire. It was something larger and drier and more indifferent. and she lifted her head and oriented to it the way an animal orients to danger, not with the specific knowledge yet, but with the body's quick assessment that something large was wrong. She could see it to the east, a line of it, already taller than it should have been, being pushed by the same northwest wind that had been shredding across the property for 3 days. She didn't run back to the house. Running wasted breath, and she was going to need her breath. She walked fast, the stride of someone who has a lot of ground to cover and knows it, and she was doing the calculation as she walked. Wind direction, speed of a range fire in this kind of dry grass, distance to the hawthorn cattle in the northwest section, distance to the secondary water points, the water available at each one. Colton was on the porch when she came up to the house. He'd seen the smoke. "It's on the Alderton East section," she said. "Wind's northwest. It's going to move toward us faster than it looks from here." "I know," he said. His voice was controlled, but his hands on the porch rail were not loose. "The northwest herd," she said. "We've got to move them south, back toward the main operation. The secondary water point on the west side of the northwest section is going to be the first thing the fire reaches if it comes across. That's the access point the cattle will go to if they panic." He was already moving, off the porch, toward the barn. "I'll get the men." "Get Russ first," she said. "I need him for the water." He looked back at her. "The water?" "The surface tank on the northwest section, the one we've been letting refill since October. If we can get water running along the fire break on the south edge of that section." She stopped. "We won't stop a running fire with water, but we can define where it will and won't go. Buy time for the herd to move south." He stared at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully categorize. Then he called for Russ. The next 6 hours were the kind that collapse when you try to remember them later. Not because nothing happened, but because so much happened that the mind can only hold pieces, impressions, specific sensory moments that burned in while the rest blurred. She remembered the cattle first, the northwest herd's behavior when the smoke reached them. Not quite panic, not yet, but that particular agitated bunching that preceded it, the animals beginning to move it against each other with the formless urgency of things that could smell what was coming but couldn't name it. She remembered Toby, white-faced and competent, doing what she'd told him without question, working the east flank of the herd with a focus she wouldn't have predicted from the boy who'd sat on a rock turning his hat in his hands 4 months ago. She remembered Russ on the surface tank, understanding immediately what she was trying to do with the water, moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who knew this land at the level of the body. The surface tank had come up considerably since October. Not full, but enough. Enough for what she needed. She remembered Deke. He came with the rest of the hands. You didn't stay away from a range fire, whatever else was happening. That was a line nobody crossed. And he took the assignment Colton gave him for the south flank of the herd movement without argument. But somewhere in the middle of it, when the fire had jumped the Alderton fence line and was moving across the dry grass with the specific unstoppable energy of something that had found its element, she saw Deke stop. He was on his horse, 70 yards from her, and he was looking at the fire, and she could see in the set of his body the specific paralysis of a man who had been on this land for 11 years and was watching something that his experience told him couldn't be stopped. The cattle on his flank were beginning to drift wrong. She moved toward him, not because she had time for it, she barely had time for it, but because if the south flank drifted, they lost the organized movement they'd been building, and the whole calculation changed. She came up beside his horse and said, loud enough to cut over the wind and the noise of the herd, "Deke, south flank, now!" He looked at her. In his face, for the first time since she'd arrived, she saw something that wasn't contempt or territorial resistance or the careful blankness he'd been showing her for months. She saw something closer to fear. Not the coward's kind. The kind that comes when a man realizes the thing he's been certain about has turned out to be different from what he thought. "That fire's going to jump the creek bed," he said. "I know," she said. "The water'll hold it on the south side. Russ has it. But not if the cattle drift into that section first. Move the south flank." He looked at her for 2 seconds that felt longer. Then he turned his horse and moved. The fire did jump the creek bed. She'd known it would. The creek bed was nearly dry, a few standing pools and otherwise cracked pale soil, and the grass on both banks was the same dry dead grass as everywhere else. The water she'd diverted from the surface tank had soaked the ground along the south edge of the northwest section in a band about 30 feet wide. And when the fire hit that band, it slowed, guttered, found nothing to sustain it the way it had been sustained on the dry grass, and it moved sideways instead of through. It didn't stop the fire. It redirected it. It pushed it east along the band of soaked ground, away from the remaining cattle, away from the main Hawthorne operation, toward the open country on the Alderton East section, where there was nothing left to lose because it had already burned. It was not a perfect outcome. The northwest section's northwest corner burned. The grass there, the fence line, a water trough. 3 cattle were separated in the confusion and found the next morning on the east side of the creek bed, unharmed, looking as though they'd had a difficult night and had opinions about it. But the main herd was intact. The new Hereford cattle were intact. The core of the operation, the breeding program, the water system, the south pasture that had been resting for 4 months and was showing the early green of real recovery, none of that was touched. Maggie stood in the afternoon, when the fire had burned itself to nothing in the open country to the east, and she looked at what remained and felt something that was not triumph. It was more complicated than triumph. It was the feeling of someone who had done the work they said they would do and had it hold up under the worst conditions it could have faced, and who was also very tired and still had to think about what the fence repair in the northwest corner was going to cost. Colton found her there. He was covered in smoke the same as everyone, and he looked at her with an expression that had shed almost everything she'd come to expect from him and was left with something simpler. "The water," he said. "That was you." "The tank had enough in it because we left it alone in October," she said. "I just knew where to put it." It was quiet. Around them, men were moving through the property doing the assessment that happened after any disaster. Cataloging damage, finding animals, checking structures. She could see Toby in the distance talking to Russ, both of them gesturing at the burned northwest corner with the specific animation of people who'd gotten through something and hadn't quite processed it yet. "Deke moved the south flank," she said. Colton looked at her. "He hesitated," she said. "Then he moved it. The cattle would have drifted without him." She said it plainly, without any construction around it. Colton seemed to think about that for a moment. "I'll talk to him." "I'm not asking you to," she said. "I'm just telling you what happened." He nodded. They stood there for a moment in the gray afternoon, in the smell of burned grass and cold air, and it was the closest they'd stood to each other without the distance of the house, or the desk, or the formality of the working day between them, and neither of them moved away from it. Then he said, "You need to eat something." She almost laughed. It came out more tired than anything. "Clara's going to have something at the house," he said. "Russ and Toby. Clara'll feed everyone," he said. He started walking back and she fell in beside him, and they walked back to the house without touching and without the particular performance of distance that had characterized the first weeks. And somewhere in the space between those two things, something had shifted that neither of them was ready to name yet. The weeks after the fire had their own specific quality. Damage assessment, fence repair, the northwest corner to be reseeded in the spring, insurance conversations with the county agent who came out and walked the burned section with a clipboard, and the careful eyes of a man spending other people's money. The Alderton operation had lost nearly 2,000 acres of grazing land and a significant portion of their east herd. Animals found over the following week in ones and twos, badly off, beyond economic recovery. The Hardcastle losses were smaller, but not small. The Hawthorne losses were real, but manageable. That word, manageable, began appearing in Colton's conversations with the county agent, with the bank officer who came in February, with the stock buyer who came in March to look at the current herd, and came away from it with an expression Maggie recognized as a buyer, recalculating what he'd expected to find. "Your current stock is in better condition than anything I've seen in this county since last spring," the buyer told Colton, but he was looking at Maggie when he said it. She let Colton do the talking with the buyer. She sat at the side of the room with her notebooks and answered when she was directly asked, which was 3 times, and each time she answered with the kind of precision that made the buyer write something down. He asked about the new cattle. She told him their bloodline, their feeding condition, her projected timeline for the first market-quality animals from the breeding program. He wrote all of it down. When the buyer left, Colton sat for a moment at the kitchen table with his coffee and the note the buyer had left with a preliminary price indication for the spring animals, and he looked at the number for a long time. "That's 40% above what Hardcastle got in December," he said. "Hardcastle sold in distress in a drought year," she said. "We didn't sell." "Because you said not to." Because the numbers said not to, she said. He looked at the number again. She watched something reorganize in his face. Not surprise exactly, because the logic had been clear for months, but the specific thing that happens when logic becomes real, when the numbers stop being abstract and become an actual price. An actual man had written on actual paper and left on your table. The spring sell, he said. If we hold the same discipline, we'll be in a different position than we've been in years, she said. I'm not saying we're out of it. The bank conversation in February is still the bank conversation in February, but the position has changed. He nodded slowly. Maggie. He said her name the way he'd started saying it sometime around the wildfire, without the considered quality of someone being careful. Just her name, easy. The bank meeting. I'd like you there. She looked at him. I'll be there, she said. Deke came to the study on a Thursday evening in February, which was 6 weeks after the fire and a long time after she'd stopped expecting him. She was working on spring rotation plans. The south pasture was genuinely recovering now, a thing she could see plainly and measure precisely, and she was building the schedule for reintroducing the herd to it, when she heard the knock on the open door and looked up. He was holding his hat in his hands, not turning it the way Toby used to when he was nervous, just holding it. His face had the closed, careful look of a man who'd decided to do something and wasn't going to allow himself to rethink it on the way through. Got a minute? He said. Yes, she said. He came in and sat in the chair across the desk. He looked at the papers spread across the surface, the grazing schedules, the pasture maps, the breeding timeline, and something moved in his face that was almost, but not quite, readable. The fire, he said. What you did with the water. She waited. I'd been looking at that tank all fall, he said, thinking about patching the north berm. Didn't know what you were planning for it. He paused. Didn't ask. She didn't say anything to that. She understood he wasn't looking for absolution, just marking what was true. 11 years I worked for the old man, Deke said. He trusted me. When he died, I thought... He stopped, looked at the wall, came back. I thought I was keeping something of his going, the way I ran things. Turns out maybe I was just keeping it still. She considered that for a moment. You kept it from falling apart, she said. That's real work. The records from the last 4 years are incomplete, but there's nothing in them that looks irresponsible given what you knew. You were managing a system that was already declining, and you didn't have the information to understand why. He looked at her. Whatever he'd expected from this conversation, it wasn't that. The south pasture, she said. You've been watching it come back. I have, he said. What do you see? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I see what it looked like 8 years ago. She nodded. That's what the old records were showing it could be. Your boss's father knew. Deke looked at the papers on the desk, at the pasture maps. She watched him look at them the way she'd watched him look at the land that day on horseback, when she'd told him what she saw in the south pasture, and his face had done that thing, the recognition that came from being out here long enough to know truth from theory. What do you need from me? He said. It came out even, practical. The tone of a man who'd gotten to the other side of something and was ready to figure out what came next. She told him. She was specific and detailed, and she didn't make it easy or make it gentle, because he was a man who didn't want either of those things. She told him what the spring work was going to require, where his experience was genuinely irreplaceable, what parts of the operation she was still learning, and where his knowledge of this specific land was more current than anything in her notebooks. He listened the way she'd been listened to, with attention, with occasional questions that were practical and pointed, without the performance of agreement or the performance of resistance. When she finished, he stood up and put his hat back on. All right, he said. He walked out of the study. She heard his boots cross the hall and go out the back and cross the yard toward the bunkhouse, and she sat at the desk for a moment and let herself feel the specific fatigue of a long thing that had finally found its right ending. Outside, the February night was clear and very cold and enormous, the way nights in this country were, the sky pressing down close with its indifferent quantity of stars. She went back to the spring rotation plans. There was a south pasture to bring back properly, and new cattle to bring along, and a bank meeting in the morning, and the first pale evidence of real grass in a field that had been stripped to its roots was showing itself patient and unhurried in the cold, the way good things came back when you gave them what they needed and had the sense to wait. The bank meeting was at 9 in the morning, and Maggie was dressed and at the kitchen table with her notebooks and the accounts ledger by 7:15. Clara, who had been watching the household change for 6 months, with the quiet attentiveness of someone who understood that households were living things, set a cup of coffee in front of her without being asked and said, "You want breakfast before you go in there and do whatever it is you're about to do?" "Yes," Maggie said. "Thank you, Clara." Clara made eggs and didn't ask questions, which was one of the things Maggie had come to value about her. Colton came downstairs at 7:40 in the good jacket he wore for town, and he looked at Maggie at the table with her notebooks and the accounts, and he said, "How bad is it going to be?" "The position is better than it was in August," she said. "The loan officer knows the county. He's seen what happened to the Alderton and Hardcastle operations. He'll compare." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him. "It's going to be a difficult conversation," she said, "but we have something to show him. That's different from what most people are walking in with right now." He poured his coffee and stood at the counter and drank half of it in the particular way of a man preparing himself for something. He'd been doing more of that since the fire, not brooding exactly, but thinking in a way that was visible. She'd noticed it without saying anything about it. "There are 2 loan officers at First Culberson," she said. "The one we're seeing today is named Garrett. He worked the cattle industry before he went into banking. His father had a small operation outside of Pecos. He's going to understand what he's looking at when I show him the breeding records and the pasture recovery data." Colton looked at her. "How do you know about his father?" "I asked Clara," she said. "Clara knows everyone in this county." From the kitchen, without looking up from the stove, Clara said, "I do." Something shifted in Colton's face that was the closest thing to amusement she'd seen from him. It didn't last long, but it was real. Garrett was a compact, careful man in his mid-50s with the kind of tan you only got from years of outdoor work before you moved indoors. And he shook Maggie's hand without the brief hesitation that some men still performed. The half-second of recalibration when a woman arrived in a business context they'd been picturing differently. He shook her hand the way he shook Colton's, which told her something useful about him. The office was small and the chairs were hard, and the window behind Garrett looked out on the main street of the county seat, which was not a busy street. Maggie set her notebooks and the accounts ledger on the corner of his desk with the orderly precision of someone who had organized these materials many times in her head before today. Garrett looked at the stack. He looked at Colton. He said, "The Hawthorne account has been a concern of this bank's for about 3 years." "I know," Colton said. "The drought year has not helped the situation across the board." Garrett folded his hands on the desk. "What I've been seeing from most operators in this county is consolidation and reduction, selling down. What I have not been seeing is any reason to extend credit further into a contracting market." He paused. "So tell me why Hawthorne Ranch is a different conversation." Colton looked at Maggie. She opened the first notebook. She spent 40 minutes walking Garrett through it. Not all of it. The selected material she'd organized specifically for this purpose. Building the picture in the order that made the most sense to a man who understood cattle but had been looking at it through banking numbers for 15 years. The South Pasture recovery data, the water system repair and what it had saved in tank loss during the drought, the herd movement strategy and what the Northwest Section grass data showed, the fire damage and the specific reason the Hawthorne loss had been bounded while the neighboring losses had not. Then the breeding program. She put the timeline in front of him and walked him through it from the old man's original plan to the current state of the first phase animals. She had photographs. She'd arranged to have photographs taken of the Hereford bulls in November, practical photographs that showed the animals plainly and without staging. She put those in front of Garrett too. He looked at them for a long time. Then he looked up and said, "The spring market price for quality Hereford cross is going to be what it's going to be. You're projecting," he looked at her numbers, "a 35% premium over last year's Hawthorne sale price. Based on the buyer's preliminary indication in March," she said, "which I have in writing if you'd like to see it." Garrett looked at Colton. "Is this accurate? He put it in writing?" "He did," Colton said. Garrett looked at the buyer's note, which Maggie had included at the back of the second notebook specifically for this moment. He read it twice. He set it down with the particular care of someone handling a document that had changed the shape of what they'd been thinking. "This operation was in significant distress 8 months ago," Garrett said. He said it to the room, not quite to either of them specifically. "Yes," Maggie said. And you've been managing it since August, she said. He looked at her. What's your background, Mrs. Hawthorne? Farming family in Haskell County, she said. Small operation. My father kept thorough records and I kept them with him. I've been studying range management independently for 3 years. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, a wagon went past on the street. The bank is going to need a revised repayment schedule, he said. The current terms are not sustainable given the missed payments in the drought year. I have a proposed schedule, she said. She opened the ledger to the page she'd prepared, based on the spring sale and the projected second phase breeding returns. He looked at it. He looked at it for a while. This is contingent on the spring market holding, he said. It is, she said. The buyer's indication gives us reasonable confidence, but yes, it's contingent. And if the spring market drops, then we come back and have another conversation, she said. But the ranch is in better structural condition than it has been in 3 years. The water system is sound. The pastures are recovering. The breeding program is the right program for this land. Whatever the spring market does, those facts are true. Garrett looked at the ledger page. He looked at the notebooks. He looked at Colton, who had let Maggie run the meeting with a stillness that was not passivity. She could feel him behind her, present and considered, the way a man could be present when he decided to trust the person who was speaking. Give me a week, Garrett said. I'll have the board review the revised schedule. He stood. Maggie began gathering her materials. Mrs. Hawthorne, Garrett said. She looked up. This is the most thorough presentation I've had in this office in 2 years, from anyone. She held his look. Thank you, she said. Outside in the cold February air, Colton stood beside her on the sidewalk for a moment. A week, he said. A week, she agreed. It's going to be all right. He looked at her. How sure are you? Reasonably, she said. Which is the best anyone can be. He nodded slowly. He looked down the street in the flat winter light, and he said, very quietly, as if he were saying it to himself as much as to her, my father would have liked you. She didn't know what to do with that exactly, so she said nothing, and they walked to where the horses were tied and rode back to the ranch in the cold, and neither of them made it into more than it was. Garrett's letter arrived in 9 days, not 7, and Colton brought it in from the road himself and set it on the kitchen table in front of Maggie without opening it. She looked at him. You open it, he said. She opened it. She read it. She set it down on the table and said, They've approved the revised schedule. 18-month extension on the core note, quarterly reviews. Colton sat down. He put both hands flat on the table and he sat there for a moment with his eyes closed. And Maggie looked at him and understood that the weight he'd been carrying since she'd arrived, the weight that had been there long before she arrived, that had been building since the old man died and the records stopped being neat and the land started saying things nobody was listening to, had moved, not gone, but moved to a place where it wasn't pressing on everything else. Quarterly reviews, he said. We'll make them, she said. He opened his eyes and looked at her and said, Yes, we will. The spring sale happened in April, and the price was not 35% above the previous year. It was 41% above. The buyer came himself, didn't send a representative, came in person, which was a thing stock buyers didn't do unless they were serious. And he walked through the cattle with Maggie and Deke, and he asked the questions that serious buyers asked. And at the end of it, he named a price that made Deke, who was not a man given to visible reaction, go very still. They negotiated for 20 minutes. Maggie did the negotiating. Colton stood to the side and watched, and what he watched was his wife, the woman who had arrived on a wagon in August with a canvas bag and a bone-handled knife and a dog-eared range management pamphlet. Tell a professional cattle buyer with complete specificity and zero deference exactly what the animals were worth and why, and exactly what the floor was below which the conversation was finished. The buyer accepted a price 4% below Maggie's opening figure and 3% above his opening figure, and he shook her hand on it with the look of a man who had enjoyed the negotiation even though he hadn't won it. After he left, Deke looked at the number written on the sale agreement. That's more than this ranch has cleared on a spring sale in 6 years, he said. I know, she said. He looked at her. Not the way he'd looked at her for the first months, that long, flat, hostile look of a man defending territory. Something had changed in the way Deke looked at her since the night he came to the study, and it had continued changing through the winter and the fence repairs and the spring preparation quietly in the way that real changes happened, not announced, just present one day in a way that it hadn't been before. The second phase cattle, he said, the breeder you're working with. What does the timeline look like? She told him. He listened and asked 3 questions, all of them practical and specific, and she answered all 3. Then he nodded and went back to work. And she stood for a moment in the spring air, holding the sale agreement with a number on it that was going to make the bank's quarterly review in June a different kind of conversation than she'd walked into in February. Sad. The people who had laughed at her when she stepped off the wagon did not apologize. That was not how it worked, and she'd never expected it to be. What happened instead was quieter and more actual. The particular recalibration that happened when people adjusted their behavior without adjusting their self-narrative. When they started treating you differently without saying why. Because saying why would mean acknowledging what they'd thought before, and nobody wanted to do that. The hands on the ranch had shifted steadily through the winter and spring. Not all of them. There were 2 men still in Deke's original circle who maintained a careful distance from her. Not hostile now, but not warm, and she let that be what it was. The others had found their way to something that, if it wasn't respect in the formal sense, was at least the working acknowledgement that the person telling them what to do knew what she was talking about. Toby was something different. Toby had started meeting her at the North Well on Saturday mornings with questions. Not the performing kind of questions, the kind people asked to seem engaged, but real ones, specific, rooted in things he'd been observing during the week and turning over in his head. She answered them carefully and completely and started asking him questions back about what he was seeing in the south pasture, about the condition of the fence lines in the northwest corner, about the secondary well's yield on different days. His answers were good. Better than good sometimes. He had the particular attention of someone who'd grown up working land and had never been given a framework for what he was already noticing. She started bringing him into the record keeping. Not as a clerk, as a learner. She showed him the system, the cross-referencing, the way you tracked patterns across seasons and years. He was slow with the writing, but fast with the patterns. And she thought about the old man's neat ledgers and what it would have meant if someone had started showing him those things at 17. Colton noticed. He didn't say anything about it directly, but she could feel him noticing the way she'd learned to feel the things he registered without speaking, which was its own kind of language that they'd been building between them without any explicit decision to do so. Their marriage had not become a conventional one. She still slept in her room, behind the wall with the locked connecting door. They ate supper together most nights and breakfast together when the morning allowed it, and they talked, increasingly, about more than the ranch, about his father and what he remembered, about her family in Haskell County, about the county itself and the other operations, and the broader movements of the cattle market. Conversations that had started as practical and stayed practical, but had accumulated something alongside the practicality, the weight of 2 people who had learned each other's thinking. She did not know what to call what was between them. She was not sure it needed a name yet. It was enough that it was real. Well, the letter from the Hardcastle lawyer arrived in May. It was addressed to Colton, but he brought it to the study and set it in front of Maggie, which was itself a statement of something. She read it. The Hardcastle operation had been purchased, not publicly collapsed, but quietly absorbed, by a consortium that included 2 names she recognized from the legal notices she'd found in the accounts folder in her first week. Men who had been waiting for operations in this county to fail. The letter informed Colton, in the measured language of legal courtesy, that the consortium's newly acquired land included a section of the western property line that had been the subject of an unresolved boundary dispute between the Hawthorne and Hardcastle operations for some years. The consortium wished to resolve this matter and was prepared to discuss terms. Maggie put the letter down. "How long has this boundary dispute been unresolved?" she said. "Since before my father died," Colton said. He was standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, which was the posture he used when something was troubling him that he was not yet ready to talk around the edges of. "The Hardcastle family and my father had an informal agreement. The consortium won't honor informal." "What does the actual survey say?" "There isn't one. Not recent. The original land grant description is—" He stopped. "It's ambiguous, in a way that was fine when it was 2 neighbors and a handshake. Maggie looked at the letter again. She looked at the two names she recognized. These men arranged our marriage, she said. It wasn't a question. Colton went very still. Yes, she had known it for months, had known it from the legal notices and from the way certain things added up when you spent enough time with the records. But she'd been waiting for him to say it. She'd understood that he would say it when he was ready, and she'd been patient about it the way she'd been patient about other things she'd known before he was ready to name them. They thought I'd be a burden that would speed the collapse, she said. Yes, he said. He said it with a flatness that told her he'd been sitting with the specific discomfort of that truth for some time. And now they have the Hardcastle land and a boundary dispute with a ranch that's no longer collapsing, she said. Yes. She looked at the letter. The boundary dispute was real. She could see that from the land descriptions, which she'd looked at early on and noted as something that would need attention eventually. It was the kind of thing that was fine when it was two neighbors and a handshake, and that became a weapon when one of the neighbors was replaced by a consortium that had purchased specifically to apply pressure. I need to see the original land grant documents, she said. Everything you have, survey notes, correspondence with your father's lawyer, any maps from the original filing. Why? Because ambiguous boundaries get resolved by whoever does the better research, she said. And I'd like to start doing that research before they do. He looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light was coming through the study window, and outside the south pasture was green, genuinely green now, coming back in a way that was visible from the house. And the new cattle were somewhere in the northwest section under Russ's quiet management, and the spring sale money was in the bank against the revised loan schedule. The documents are in a trunk in the attic, he said. My father kept everything. Good, she said. I'll start tonight. The trunk had 40 years of paper in it, the particular archaeology of a family that had built something from nothing and kept records of every transaction, every dispute, every agreement with every neighbor, and every government office that had ever had anything to do with this land. It smelled of old paper and the cedar lining of the trunk, and something else underneath that she thought of, without meaning to, as the smell of time. She carried the relevant documents down to the study in 2 trips and spent 3 evenings sorting them, building a timeline of the property's legal history from the original grant forward. It was painstaking work, and not all of it was in order. Some documents had been filed carelessly, some were copies of copies, some were in a handwriting she had to spend time learning before she could read it efficiently. On the 3rd evening she found it. It was a survey note, not the formal survey, but a working note, written by the original county surveyor and filed with a boundary correspondence letter from 1871. It described the western property line in terms of a natural feature, a dry creek bed that had shifted sometime in the intervening 20 years, and it included a compass bearing that, when she plotted it on the current map, put the actual boundary line approximately 80 yards east of where the consortium was claiming it now sat. 80 yards didn't sound like much. On paper, in a legal description, it was significant. On the ground, across the full length of the western property line, it was the difference between a dispute and a settled question. She sat with the survey note for a long time, reading it again, checking her compass bearing calculation twice, making sure she was reading the notation correctly and not finding what she wanted to find instead of what was there. It was there. She got up and went to find Colton. He was in the barn, late, past 9, doing the last round that ranchers did out of habit more than necessity. She came in with the survey note and the map, and she spread them on the flat top of a feed barrel, and she showed him, step by step, what she'd found and what it meant. He read the survey note. He looked at the compass bearing she'd calculated. He looked at the map. This needs to go to a lawyer, he said. It does, she said. It needs to go to a good one. Not the county seat, someone in Odessa or further, someone the consortium hasn't already talked to. He looked at the survey note again. The barn was quiet around them, the horses settled, the specific nighttime breathing of a working barn that was healthy. My father knew this land, he said. It came out the way things came out when he said them about his father, with a complicated undercurrent of grief and admiration and the specific pain of understanding someone more clearly after they were gone than you had when they were present. He would have known about the creek bed shift. I think he did know, she said. I think he and Hardcastle Sr. had worked it out between them the way neighbors work things out, and it was never formalized because they trusted each other. And now the men who bought Hardcastle's land don't have any reason to honor what two neighbors understood about a creek bed. Not unless we give them one, she said. He looked at her. In the barn light, his face was tired, and in the tiredness was something else. The specific look of a man who had spent a year learning that he'd underestimated someone and was still, occasionally, surprised by the depth of that underestimation. Where did you find this? He said. In your father's trunk, she said. In the attic. I haven't been in that trunk in years. I know, she said. She didn't say what she was thinking, which was, that was always going to be someone else's job, finding the things in the trunk. That's been true since he died. It just took a while for the someone else to get here. She said, I'll write to the lawyers in Odessa tomorrow. Do you want to look at names, or should I find them myself? Find them yourself, he said. You'll pick better ones than I would. She gathered the documents and rolled the map carefully and went back to the house, and she heard him behind her, putting out the barn lamp, checking the horses one more time the way he always did, moving through the routine of a night on a working ranch, with the bone-deep ease of a man who had never been anything but this and was learning to be glad of it. The Odessa lawyers were a firm of two, father and son, the father semi-retired but still sharp, the kind of sharp that came from 40 years of working West Texas land law, which was its own particular discipline. They drove out to the ranch in late May and walked the western boundary with Maggie and Colton and the survey note and the current map, and the older lawyer, to name whose name was Aldous, an old name that suited him, crouched at the dry creek bed and looked at the landscape and looked at the bearing notation and said, to no one in particular, well, that's interesting. Is it sufficient? Maggie said. Aldous looked up at her. He had the same quality Garrett the banker had had, the quality of a man who assessed things rather than people, and who assessed things accurately. It's a strong foundation, he said. In combination with the boundary correspondence letter and the original grant language, it establishes a clear case for the line your husband's family has historically maintained. He stood. His knees gave him trouble, and he didn't remark on it. The consortium will have their own lawyers. This will be a conversation, not a conclusion. I understand that, she said. But it's a strong foundation, he said again. And she understood that he was a man who chose his words carefully and was not inflating things, and that strong foundation from Aldous meant something real. The legal correspondence began in June and ran through the summer. Maggie managed it, not the legal argumentation, that was Aldous and his son, but the documentation and the organization of the evidence and the research that supported the case. She found 2 more relevant documents in the trunk. She found a third in the county records office in the county seat, a filing she'd identified as potentially existing based on the reference notation in the 1871 correspondence and confirmed after an afternoon in a back room with boxes of county records that hadn't been organized since they were filed. The county records office clerk, a woman of about 60 named Mrs. Pruitt, who had been working in that office for 23 years, watched Maggie work through the boxes with an expression that started as polite patience and shifted over the course of the afternoon to something more engaged. You're the Hawthorne woman, Mrs. Pruitt said, in the late afternoon. Maggie Hawthorne, she said. I heard about the fire, Mrs. Pruitt said. My nephew works the Alderton place. He said the Hawthorne herd came through better than anyone expected. We got lucky with the water, Maggie said. Mrs. Pruitt looked at her over her reading glasses with the specific expression of a woman who had been hearing men get lucky and women get lucky for 60 years and understood the difference between luck and preparation. My nephew also said the woman up at Hawthorne Ranch knew where to put it, she said. Maggie found the document she was looking for at 4:15 in the afternoon, and she set it on the table very carefully and read it twice, and then said, Mrs. Pruitt, I need to have this copied. Mrs. Pruitt came and looked at it. Then she looked at Maggie. I'll do it myself, she said. So it's official. The document was a county surveyor's boundary confirmation from 1879, referencing the original 1871 note and confirming the compass bearing. It had been filed in response to a minor boundary question between the Hawthorne and a different neighbor, resolved and then forgotten, buried in 20 years of subsequent filings. In the context of the current dispute, it was not just supporting evidence. It was, as Aldous said when she sent it to him, the thing that made the case something other than a conversation. The consortium's lawyers went quiet for 3 weeks after Aldous sent them the documents. Then they wrote back proposing a settlement that acknowledged the Hawthorne boundary line. It was not everything. There were conditions and a timeline and a monitoring arrangement that Aldous recommended accepting. Maggie read the settlement terms 3 times and then sat down with Colton and went through it section by section, and at the end of it he said, "What do you think?" "I think it's a reasonable settlement," she said. "I think they were hoping the ranch would be easier to push around than it turned out to be." Colton looked at the settlement. He looked at the signature line. He looked at Maggie. "They sent you to be the thing that pushed it over," he said, "and you ended up being the thing that held it together." She looked at the settlement, and she thought about the letter that had come to her mother's house in Haskell County, forwarded twice, addressed in formal lawyer's hand. She thought about the wagon, and the heat, and the sound of men laughing. "Sign it," she said. He signed it. She witnessed it. Aldous' son rode out the next day to collect it and take it back to Odessa, and that was the end of the boundary dispute, and in some meaningful sense, the end of the long pressure that the men who had arranged this marriage had been trying to apply to the Hawthorne operation since before she arrived. She found out later, through Mrs. Pruitt, who knew everything in this county, and had decided, apparently, that Maggie was worth knowing, that the 2 men behind the consortium had also backed away from 2 other county operations they'd been circling. Whether that was connected to the boundary settlement, or had its own reasons she didn't know and didn't spend much time thinking about. It was enough that it was done. On an evening in late July, a full year after she'd arrived on the wagon, Maggie sat on the porch in the warm dark and looked at the south pasture. It was fully green now. Not the struggling, tentative green of early spring, but the dense, settled green of a pasture that had come back to what it was meant to be. Grass standing the right height, the soil underneath it holding, the roots down where they needed to be. The new herd would go onto it in the fall, and it would hold them properly, the way it had been designed to hold them before it was stripped and exhausted and left to decline. She heard the screen door behind her, and Colton came out and sat in the other chair. There were 2 chairs on the porch now, which had not been true when she arrived, which Clara had arranged sometime in the spring without comment, and he looked at the pasture too. They sat for a while without talking, which was something they could do now without it carrying the weight it had carried in the first months. "Toby asked me today if you'd teach him double-entry bookkeeping," Colton said. "I know," she said. "He asked me last week. I told him to ask you first." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because he works for you," she said. "Because it's your ranch." He was quiet for a moment. The night insects were loud in the pasture grass, which was its own kind of good sign. Insects came back to healthy ground. "It's our ranch," he said. He said it simply, without construction around it, and she heard it the same way, not as a declaration of something, as a statement of what was currently true. She looked at the south pasture, fully recovered and quietly alive in the dark, and she felt the specific quality of a year's worth of work that had held up. And she thought about her father's ledgers and her mother's house and the letter that had come forwarded twice, and she thought, well, "I'll start teaching Toby next week," she said. Colton said, "Good." The night went on around them, large and indifferent and full of the sounds of a working ranch settling into itself. And neither of them had anything to add to that, so they sat with it until the lamp inside needed tending, and they went in. The second year began the way the first had ended, with work, and with the specific quality of work that had finally found its right shape. Maggie was up before dawn most mornings, not because the ranch demanded it of her the way it had in those first exhausting weeks when everything was emergency and triage, but because the early morning had become the time she thought most clearly. She would make coffee in the still kitchen and stand at the window with her notebook and look out at the south pasture in the gray pre-light, watching the way the land declared itself before the day's heat arrived. It was a habit she'd built without noticing she was building it, the way most of the habits that mattered had come, gradually, as the accumulation of what the work required. The south pasture was carrying the main herd now. She'd moved them onto it in September, as she'd planned, and the grass had held the way she'd said it would, and the cattle had moved through it in the rotation she'd designed, and by November the pasture data she recorded in her current notebook, the 5th since she'd arrived, showed a system in balance for the first time in the decade the old records covered. She showed the data to Colton one evening, and he looked at it for a long time without saying anything, and then he said, "My father's breeding program. Second phase, you said spring." "Late spring," she said. "April. if the breeder confirms the animals we discussed. He nodded. He set the notebook down with the particular care he'd developed for her notebooks, which she noticed without remarking on. The bank review is in March. I know, she said. We'll be in better position than June. How much better? She told him. The number she gave him was careful, not the optimistic number, not the conservative number, but the number that had the best honest case behind it. He looked at it, and she could see him doing what he always did with numbers now, not flinching from them, but reading them the way she'd taught him to read them, as a description of reality rather than a verdict on his adequacy. That's enough to clear the drought arrears, he said. Yes, she said. With something over. He was quiet. Colton, she said. She waited until he looked at her. We're going to be all right. He held her look for a moment. You keep saying that. I keep being right, she said. Something crossed his face that was the full version of that near smile she'd been seeing for months. It lasted longer than the others had. The letter from her cousin Della arrived in October, the first real personal correspondence Maggie had received since she'd come to the ranch. Della wrote the way she talked, in a rush, with information delivered sideways, the important things embedded in the middle of paragraphs about other things. Maggie read it at the kitchen table while Clara moved around her starting supper, and somewhere in the third paragraph she stopped and read a section twice. Della had heard about the Hawthorne Ranch, not from Maggie, from a stock agent who had passed through Haskell County and spoken to someone who'd spoken to Della's husband, one of those long chains of word that moved through cattle country the way water moved through limestone, finding every crack. What the agent had said was that the Hawthorne operation had come through the drought year better than any comparable ranch in Culberson County, and that there was a woman running the cattle management there who had done something with the breeding program that people in the business were paying attention to. Della wrote, I told him you were my cousin, and he looked at me like I'd said I was related to President Arthur, and I think you have some explaining to do. Maggie read that twice also, and then she set the letter down and looked at the window and felt something move through her that was not quite what she would have called pride. It was quieter than pride, more complicated. It was the feeling of someone who had been invisible for a long time, becoming, in some small way, visible. Not to the world. To Della, who had watched her fold that first letter on the kitchen table and had not argued when Maggie said nobody here was lining up to offer her anything better. She wrote back that evening. She told Della about the South Pasture and the breeding program and the boundary settlement, and she told her about Toby, who was now keeping the water records himself and had a natural eye for the land that she thought would make him, eventually, a very good ranch manager. She told her about Clara and about Russ and about Deke. Not everything about Deke, but enough. She did not tell her about the 2 chairs on the porch, because that was still a thing she was thinking about more than she was ready to explain. She sealed the letter and put it with the outgoing post and didn't think about Della's response, because you couldn't think about every response that was coming and still have enough attention left for the work. The March bank review was conducted by Garrett and, unexpectedly, by the bank's regional officer, who had come down from Midland to observe. Maggie found out about the regional officer's presence when she walked into the office and found an additional man at the table, younger than Garrett, with the specific compressed alertness of someone who had been told to evaluate something and intended to do it thoroughly. His name was Forsyth. He shook her hand and she shook his, and she put her notebooks and ledgers on the desk the same way she had in February the previous year, and she delivered the review the same way, methodically, sequentially, with the actual numbers presented plainly and the reasoning behind each decision made visible. The numbers were better than she'd told Colton to expect, because she always told Colton the careful number and held the better possibility in reserve until it was confirmed. The drought arrears were cleared. The revised loan schedule was current with a month's buffer. The spring sale projections, supported by a second written indication from the buyer. She'd made it a practice to get everything in writing, a habit that had begun with the boundary documents and extended outward, showed a continuing improvement over the previous year's already improved position. Forsyth asked most of the questions. He asked them in the rapid, pressured way of someone accustomed to conducting evaluations in limited time, and she answered all of them at the same pace she always answered questions, completely, without rushing, with the specific calm of someone who had learned that the person who hurries to reassure is the person who doesn't trust their own answer. At the end of it, Forsyth looked at his notes and then at Garrett, and then, for a moment, at nothing in particular in the way of someone assembling something in their head. Mrs. Hawthorne, he said, the improvement in this account over 14 months is not typical of what we're seeing across the region. I understand that, she said. What's the variable, he said. It was an odd way to ask it. Not what did you do, but what's the variable? As if he were looking at a set of numbers that had moved unexpectedly and was trying to identify the factor that explained the movement. She thought about how to answer that. She could have said range management, breeding program, water system. All of those were true, and all of them were the kind of answer a bank officer expected. Instead, she said, someone paying attention. Forsyth looked at her. Garrett looked at his desk, and something in the angle of his head suggested he was concealing a reaction of some kind. That's an unusually simple answer, Forsyth said. Most useful things are, she said. He made a note. The meeting concluded with the bank confirming the revised schedule and Garrett adding, in the measured way of a man who chose his words with care, that the Hawthorne account had moved from the concern category to what he called the monitored favorably category, which she understood meant they were no longer waiting for it to fail. In the wagon on the way back to the ranch, Colton said, monitored favorably. It's the best category to be in after where we were, she said. He was quiet for a mile. The country around them was doing what it did in March. Still brown, still dry-looking, but with the very early suggestion of something coming, a quality in the light that wasn't summer yet, but wasn't winter anymore either. Forsyth's going to talk about this in Midland, Colton said. Probably, she said. People are going to come ask questions. She'd thought about this. Let them come, she said. The information isn't secret. The South Pasture rotation, the breeding program, the water management, none of it is proprietary. If it helps other operations in this county, that's not a loss for us. He looked at her. It might be. How? If neighboring operations recover, the market competition. If neighboring operations recover, the regional economy stabilizes, she said, which is better for land value, for infrastructure, for everything that depends on this county functioning. A county full of failed ranches is worse for Hawthorne than a county with competition. She paused. Your father knew this. He was the one who helped the Hardcastle family get through the drought of '78. It's in the records. Colton looked at the road. She saw him absorbing that. The specific way he absorbed things about his father, which was always with a complicated mixture of recognition and something that took longer to resolve. All right, he said. Let them come. They came in May. The first was a rancher named Beaumont from the northern section of the county, a careful man in his 60s who arrived unannounced on a Tuesday morning and stood at the fence looking at the south pasture with the expression of a man who was seeing something he'd been told about and was now confirming with his own eyes. Maggie came out to meet him because Colton was in the far pasture with Deke and wouldn't be back until midday. Beaumont took his hat off when she came out, which was a gesture she'd stopped being surprised by from older men who'd been raised in a certain way. He said, I heard your south pasture was something to see. He looked at it. It is. She told him what she'd done. She stood at the fence with him for 2 hours, and she was specific and practical, and she answered his questions completely. He was a man who had been working this land longer than she'd been alive, and he had the knowledge of long experience alongside the particular limits of long experience, which was that it was harder to see new possibilities in ground you thought you already fully understood. She showed him her notebooks. Not all of them. The relevant sections, the data from the South Pasture recovery, the rotation schedule, the soil assessment she'd done in those first weeks when she'd let the dirt fall through her fingers and understood what it was telling her. Beaumont read the section she showed him carefully and slowly, the way men of his generation read with their full attention and no performance of speed. The rotation intervals, he said, longer than what I've been running. Longer than most people in this county have been running, she said. The grass needs more time than we've been giving it. We've been treating the land like it has no memory, but it does. It remembers what we take out of it. He looked at the south pasture, which was full and green and carrying the herd at the density she'd calculated, the cattle distributed the way she'd designed with the water points and the shade and the cross-fencing that directed movement without forcing it. I've got a section on my east side that looks like your south pasture did, he said. I know, she said. I heard. He looked at her. Clara knows everyone in this county, she said. He laughed, short, genuine. Then he said, What would you do with it? She told him. She was clear that she was telling him what she would do, not what he should do. This was his land and his experience, and she was offering what she'd learned, not prescribing. He listened and asked 3 questions, and she answered all 3, and at the end he said, "Can I send my foreman to talk to you?" "Send him when you're ready," she said. He put his hat back on and thanked her and left. And she went back inside and wrote up the summary of the conversation in a new section of her current notebook, because she had a feeling this was not going to be the only conversation of its kind, and it was better to keep records. She was right. Beaumont's foreman came the following week. 2 weeks after that, a woman from a small operation west of the county line arrived with her husband and asked if they could walk the south pasture while Maggie explained what she'd done. They came on a Saturday, and the walk took 3 hours, and Maggie answered every question and let them take notes and showed them the breeding records when they asked about the cattle. The woman's name was Vera, and she was about 40, and she had the particular quality of someone who was very intelligent and had spent a long time in a context that hadn't asked for it. She asked the best questions Maggie had fielded since Aldous had been out for the boundary survey. At the end of it, Vera said, "How long did it take for the south pasture to look like this?" 8 months of rest and managed recovery, Maggie said, plus the 4 months before that of not making it worse. Vera looked at the pasture. A year. About a year, Maggie said. Vera looked at her. People told you it couldn't be done in a year. People told me a lot of things, Maggie said. Vera smiled. It was a small smile, and it had something in it that Maggie recognized without needing to name, because she had felt a version of it herself. The second phase breeding cattle arrived in late April, as she'd planned. 11 animals this time, specifically selected against the matrix she'd built over the winter from the original program data and the performance data from the first phase animals' first year. The breeder came with them, a quiet man named Elliot from Central Texas, who had been corresponding with Maggie for 6 months, and arrived with his own notebooks and an expression of someone who had been curious about the Hawthorne operation since the first letter. He and Maggie spent a full day going through the animals and the records together, and it was the first technical conversation she'd had with someone who could match her on the specific material. Not just understand it, but push back on it, offer different readings, know enough to know where the analysis was strong and where it was relying on assumptions she'd made consciously, but that could be questioned. Colton watched them from a distance for part of the morning. She saw him watching, but didn't say anything about it. That evening she told him what she and Elliot had concluded about the second phase program, and he listened the way he always listened, and then he said, "He disagreed with you about the bull selection." "On one point," she said, "he thought the fourth bull was a better choice than the third. I think the third is better for this specific land and this specific climate." He agreed once I showed him the soil data. Colton was quiet for a moment. What would have happened if he hadn't agreed? She thought about that. "I would have chosen the third bull anyway," she said. "I'm more certain than he is about what this land needs. He knows the bloodlines better than I do. I know this ground better than he does. Between us, we're probably right." He looked at her. "Probably?" "Probably is the best available," she said. "Anyone who tells you different is selling something." He laughed at that, a real laugh, the kind she'd been hearing more of in the second year, which came from somewhere less guarded than what she'd been offered in the first months. It changed his face in a way that she noticed, which was its own kind of information. Yeah. Toby turned 18 in June, and Maggie gave him his own notebook. Not a ceremonial gesture, a practical one. He was managing the water records independently now, and had taken on the pasture monitoring for the Northwest section, and he needed his own system rather than a section of hers. She bought the notebook in town on a supply run, and brought it back and put it on the table in the study where he came to work on Saturday mornings. And when he arrived and saw it, he picked it up and looked at it with the expression of someone receiving a thing they hadn't known they were waiting for. "That's yours," she said. "Set it up however makes sense to you. The system I use works for me. Yours should work for you." He looked at her. He was not a boy who expressed things easily. He'd grown up in a context that hadn't encouraged it, but in his face right now was something clear. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said, I mean to say," he stopped. Tried again. "Thank you for what you've been teaching me." "You've been doing the learning," she said. "That part's yours." He opened the notebook to the first page and thought about it for a moment, and then wrote something at the top, the way people did when they started a new record.
marking the beginning so it didn't get lost in everything that came after. She didn't read what he wrote. It was his.
The hardest conversation happened in August, 14 months after she'd arrived, on a night when the heat had not broken, even after dark, and the house was warm and they were sitting on the porch with the two chairs Clara had put there, and Colton said, out of a silence that had been sitting for a while without being uncomfortable, I want to talk about the arrangement. She looked at him. The night insects were going in the pasture. The sky above the flat country was enormous and thickly starred, the way it was out here in August. All right, she said. He looked at his hands. She'd seen him do this when he was working through something he hadn't found the words for yet, and she'd learned to let him work through it without filling the space with her own words, which was not always easy for her. When they arranged it, he said, I was not in a position to refuse. The ranch was in the condition it was in. The men behind it knew that. I think they believed I'd be too proud to make it work. He stopped. That I'd treat it the way it looked from the outside, which was an insult dressed up as a solution. She held the look he was giving her. It had cost him something to say that, and she knew it, and she was not going to let it land without being received properly. It looked that way to me too, she said. From my side. I know, he said. I've known that for a long time. He paused. I treated you that way, in the beginning, not... I didn't do what the men at the fence did, but I let it happen, and I was assessing you the way you assess equipment, whether you'd be useful, whether you'd be a problem. I know, she said. That was wrong, he said. Simple, flat. No elaboration, no softening. Just the acknowledgement, which was worth more to her than any amount of elaboration would have been. She looked at the south pasture in the dark. She could hear the cattle out there. The specific nighttime sounds of a herd settled and at ease in good ground. A year ago that pasture had been stripped earth. A year ago she'd been sitting on the floor of this man's study with his father's papers trying to see what was broken before anyone else decided it wasn't worth fixing. I want to ask you something, she said, and I'd like an honest answer even if it's a difficult one. All right, he said. If the ranch had been in good condition when I arrived, if there had been no crisis, no breeding program to rescue, no drought, no boundary dispute, would we be sitting on this porch having this conversation? He was quiet for a long time. I don't know, he said. He said it with the specific difficulty of an honest answer that didn't flatter him. I don't know who I would have been in that version of things. I think... He stopped, started again. I think the crisis made me listen when I might not have. I'm not proud of that, but I think it's true. She nodded slowly. It was not what she'd hoped to hear, but it was what she'd suspected, and she'd asked because she needed to know, because you couldn't build anything real on a foundation you hadn't looked at clearly. Then I'm glad for the drought, she said, which is a thing I never expected to say. He looked at her. Something in his face had opened up in a way that she associated with the moments when he stopped managing himself and was just present. Maggie, he said. Her name and his voice had been changing for months, accumulating something. She'd been aware of it, and not chasing it, letting it become what it was going to become without forcing it. I'd like this to be a real marriage. Not the arrangement, not the practical partnership, though that's real, and I value it. I'd like... He stopped. The words were harder for him than the ranch decisions had ever been. She waited. I don't know if that's something you want. I don't know if I've given you reason to want it. I wanted to ask. She looked at him. In the year she'd known him, she'd learned him in the way you learned someone when you worked alongside them every day in conditions that didn't allow for performance. She knew his thinking and his limits and the specific ways he was better than he knew and the specific ways he was still working on himself. She knew the way he talked about his father and the way he handled the animals and the way he'd changed since August. Not completely, not without backsliding, but genuinely. She'd come here because nobody had offered her anything better. That was still true, technically, but it had stopped being the reason she was here sometime around the fire, and she'd known it then and hadn't known what to do with it, and she still didn't entirely know, but that was the condition under which most honest things happened. Yes, she said. I'd like that. He looked at her with the look of a man who had prepared himself for a more complicated answer and was finding the actual answer harder to receive than the complicated one would have been, because the complicated one would have required a response, and this one just required him to sit with it. All right, he said after a moment. They sat for a while longer. Nothing between them changed in the dramatic way that stories sometimes promise things changed. No gesture, no declaration, no moment that announced itself as the moment. But when she got up to go inside, she paused at the door, and he was already looking at her, and she said, "The connecting door?" He nodded. She went inside. In a little while she heard his boots on the porch and the screen door and his steps on the stairs. The locked door was unlocked by morning, and that was how that particular thing resolved itself. Quietly, privately, without ceremony. The way the best things between people happened when there was finally enough trust to stop being careful. The years that followed were not easy in the way that stories sometimes made time sound easy when the hard part was over. The land didn't become cooperative because the people working it had finally figured each other out. There were bad seasons and good ones. A cattle sickness in the third year that cost them 11 animals, and 3 weeks of night watches. A legal question about water rights from a newly arrived operation to the north that required Aldous' son, and 4 months of correspondence to resolve in their favor. There were arguments, real ones, not the managed tensions of the first months, but the full contact arguments of two people who both had strong opinions about things that mattered and had learned each other well enough to know exactly where to push. She was wrong sometimes. That was important to say. The third-year breeding decisions included one she'd been certain about that didn't perform the way she'd predicted, and she spent 2 weeks of close evenings reconstructing exactly what she'd missed and writing it up in her notebook, not as a failure, but as data, because the only way to be right more often was to understand clearly where you'd been wrong. Colton told her during those 2 weeks that she was being too hard on herself. She told him she was being exactly hard enough on herself and that he should let her finish. He let her finish. That was, she thought, one of the things she'd come to value most in him, that he'd learned when to let her work and when to say the thing that cut through the work, and that he got it right more often than not. Deke left the ranch in the 4th year, not badly. He left to take a foreman position at a large operation in the northern part of the state, a genuine opportunity, and he came to Maggie before he talked to Colton about it, which told her something she put away as valuable. He stood in the doorway of the study the way he'd stood there on that February night 2 years earlier, with his hat in his hands, and he said, "I wanted you to know first, since you're the one who'll have to figure out the replacement." "I already have someone in mind," she said. He looked at her. She looked back. "Toby?" he said. "He's 20, she said. "He'll need managing, but he knows this land." Deke nodded slowly. He looked at the study, the notebooks on the shelf that had accumulated across 4 years, the maps with her notes in the margins, the breeding records now kept in a proper bound system she'd designed with Toby's help. "You turned this place around," he said. He said it the way he said most things, flat, without decoration, but she understood by now that flatness was his precision, not his indifference. "We turned it around," she said. He shook his head. "I didn't believe you could," he said. "I want to say that clearly. I was wrong. About what you could do and about—" He stopped. "About what you deserved to be taken seriously for." She held that. It was the apology that had not come when she'd expected it, arriving instead when it was ready, which was how apologies worked when they were real. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and went to talk to Colton, and she sat in the study and listened to their voices in the hallway, the long conversation of two men who had known each other for 15 years and were now navigating an ending that was not a bad ending, which was the best kind. Toby became foreman at 20, which was young and would have been impossible except that he'd been doing most of the work for 2 years already, and the hands knew it, and the hands knew him. His first week officially in the role, he came to Maggie and said, "What do I need to do differently now that it's official?" "Nothing," she said. "Do what you've been doing. The title is for other people. The work is what you already know." He thought about that. "What if I'm wrong about something?" "Write it down," she said. "Be specific about what you were thinking and why. The notebook doesn't judge you. It just helps you see it more clearly next time." He went home that night, and she watched him go from the porch, this 20-year-old who had arrived on the ranch at 17, turning his hat in his hands and unable to look her in the face, and she thought about what happened to people when someone took them seriously before they were completely sure they deserved it. In the 5th year, a man from an agricultural publication in Dallas came to write about the Hawthorne breeding program. He'd heard about it through the stock buyer, who had apparently told the story to enough people over enough sales seasons that it had eventually reached someone with a printing press. The man was polite and thorough, and he asked Maggie to explain the program from the beginning, which she did, standing in the pasture with him on a clear October morning, the mature first phase animals visible in the south pasture behind her. He asked her about her background. She told him Haskell County, a small farm, her father's ledgers, 3 years of reading range management publications before she ever set foot on this land. He wrote something down. Then he said, "When you arrived here, the operation was failing." "Yes," she said. "And people thought you wouldn't last." "People thought a lot of things," she said. He looked up from his notes. "What do you think is the most important thing you did, if you had to name one?" She thought about it. She thought about the south pasture and the pipeline repair and the fire and the bank meeting and the boundary documents found in a trunk in an attic. She thought about Toby's first notebook and Deke's flat, honest apology, and Colton saying our ranch on the porch in July. "I paid attention," she said, "to the land, to the numbers, to what people were actually telling me under what they were saying out loud. And I didn't let anyone else's certainty about what I couldn't do become my own." He wrote it down. He looked at it. He said, "That sounds simple." "It is simple," she said. "Simple isn't the same as easy." The article came out in January of the 6th year. Maggie read it once and put it in the files and didn't read it again, because the article was about something that had already happened, and the work in front of her was about what came next. Colton read it twice and left it on the kitchen table for a week, which she understood as his version of saying something he wasn't going to say out loud. Clara cut it out and kept it. Maggie found out about this much later from Mrs. Pruitt, who had gotten a copy from Clara and kept one herself, and who told Maggie this with the specific satisfaction of a woman who had been paying attention to the right things for a long time and was pleased to have the record confirm it. On an evening in October of the 7th year, Maggie sat on the porch in the chair that had been there since the spring Clara had put them out, and she looked at what the Hawthorne operation had become. The south pasture was into its 7th cycle of managed rotation, and the soil data she'd been tracking continuously showed it healthier now than it had been at any point in the records going back 20 years. The breeding program was in its 5th phase, the animals it was producing carrying the specific qualities the old man had been building toward across 7 patient years before he died. And the Hawthorne cattle were now the reference point in this region, the animals other breeders compared against, the quality that defined the category. The northwest section had been expanded in the 4th year. The secondary well deepened and its yield increased, the cross-fencing refined. The boundary on the west was surveyed and documented and not in question. The bank account was not what anyone would have called comfortable, because ranching was not an industry that produced comfort, but the debt was structured and current, and the position was real. Toby was 24 and had hired 2 new hands this year and had made both decisions well. He still came to the study on Saturday mornings, though now it was more often to show her something he'd found than to ask her something he didn't know. That was the right direction. Colton came out and sat beside her. They had developed across 7 years the specific domestic fluency of people who had built their understanding of each other through work and argument, and the 10,000 small daily transactions that accumulated into something larger than any of them individually. It was not a perfect thing. She would have been suspicious of it if it were. It had its weights and its silences and its history of things said wrong and heard wrong and taken longer to repair than either of them wanted. But it was real. It was genuinely, materially real, which she had come to understand was rarer than the songs and the stories made it sound. "Elliot wrote," Colton said. "He wants to come in the spring and look at the 5th phase animals." "I know," she said. "I wrote back this morning." He looked at her. "You could have told me." "I'm telling you now," she said. He looked at the pasture. She looked at it too. The light was going long and low the way it did in October out here, making everything look like it was lit from inside, the grass and the cattle and the flat enormous sky, all the same amber color for about 20 minutes before the dark came in. "You know what I've been thinking about," he said. "Tell me." "That morning," he said. "The first morning. You came downstairs with the ledger under your arm and you asked me to walk you through the water system." He paused. "I almost didn't." She looked at him. "What stopped you from not?" He thought about it. "Curiosity, mostly," he said. "You weren't what I expected. I wanted to understand what you were. And now, she said. He was quiet for a moment. The October light held and then began to go. Now I know, he said. Took me long enough. She thought about the woman who had sat on a wagon for 4 hours looking at this land and feeling something that wasn't dread and wasn't excitement but was recognition. She thought about what it meant to see a broken thing clearly and decide anyway that it was worth fixing, not because you were certain, not because you'd been given any particular reason to be, but because the alternative was going back to Haskell County and a life where nobody asked anything of you because nobody believed you had anything to give. The broken thing and the woman nobody wanted had turned out to need each other in the specific way that useful things sometimes did, not because it was destined, not because the story required it, but because she paid attention and did the work and refused, at every point where it would have been easier to stop. There was something in that worth understanding, not just for people who arrived on wagons to failing ranches in West Texas. For anyone who had ever stood somewhere and felt the weight of what everyone around them had already decided about who they were and what they were capable of, and had to choose between carrying that weight forward as fact or setting it down as someone else's opinion. The choice was always there. It was never easy. It did not come with guarantees. But the south pasture was green and the cattle were sound, and the sky above the flat country was doing what it always did, being enormous and indifferent and full of more stars than any person could count. And Maggie Whitmore Hawthorne sat on her porch in the good dark and let herself have, without apology or qualification, the life she had built with her own hands out of the materials she had been given, which were not the materials anyone would have chosen, and which had turned out, as such things sometimes did, to be exactly enough.